think democracy is the system, the way by which societies peacefully process whatever conflicts occur in liberty and peace. We would have a discussion and exchange of views about the way democracy can confront the forthcoming or the current and the forthcoming crises, and perhaps what are the ways in which we can improve the way it functions.
네, 민주주의 연구의 세계적인 석학 아담 쉐보르스키 교수를 무대로 모십니다. 큰 박수로 환영해 주십시오.
This is not the first time I'm in Korea. I had a privilege during my previous visits to be shown around the country by my former students who studied at the University of Chicago in the 1980s and became my lifelong friends. I admired the beauty of your country, and I very much appreciated and cherished their friendship. And this is why I find it particularly painful, personally touching, the tragedy that we have all experienced in the past and a few days ago. I deeply share your pain. I've realized that this is not a good moment to speak about aspects of ordinary life. Yes, Christ, in a moment of crisis, it's hard to divert our attentions from the immediate event. But I'm going to speak about our routine, I hope normal, ordinary life. And one aspect of it is democracy. You and I are privileged to live in countries in which democracy has become expected, routine, and in which we take it for granted. And my purpose is to maybe open some questions about it, to show that democracy is full not only of tensions, but also of some surprises and some mysteries. And I'm going to try to convey to you at least the way I think about democracy. Not everybody thinks about it in the same way, but I think that this particular way is useful for understanding the everyday tension of democratic politics. Just think of it this way. Democracy is a strange phenomenon. Yes? What happens in each election? About half of the voters vote against the party that wins. Half of the voters find themselves on the losing side, and they're unhappy. Moreover, some of the people who vote for the winning side become disappointed with the performance of the government. So basically, after each election, after some time, a majority is unsatisfied with what happened. And what do we all hope for? That the next time we're going to win, and that the winner will not disappoint us. We get these cycles of hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment. Is this irrational? Now, why do we value democracy? There's no single answer to that question, because different people value it for different reasons. Some people value it because they think that democracy will realize, will implement some other values which they think are superior. Political liberty, being able to live without everyday life without political interference. Political equality, the fact that everybody has equal political rights. Perhaps accountable governments, perhaps good governments. Different people attach different values. But I want to emphasize that democracy has an intrinsic value, a value in itself, which is quite obvious. Namely, it allows us, as the collectivity, as the people, to choose by whom we're going to be governed and to some extent how. We cannot all govern at the same time. We have to be governed by others, and we don't like it. But at least what democracy does, and it's unique in that, what democracy does, it allows us to choose who is going to govern us. Now, when you start looking in a longer-term historical perspective, you realize how rare democracy has been and how fragile it is. Even in the modern era, power changed hands. This is, I'm thinking, since 1788. Power has changed more frequently by coups, by violence, than by elections. 670 times by coups and 570 times by elections, I counted. Moreover, think, there are still 68 countries in the world, including the two elephants, Russia and China, that has never experienced the moment in which the government would lose an election and yield the power. So democracy has been rare and fragile. I'm going to show you some pictures just so that you have a sense of it, yes? What you see behind me, this kind of solid hill and the line of it, is the number of independent countries in the world in each year since 1800. As you see, the number of countries increased in the interwar period, and then there was a massive wave of decolonialization, so now there are about 200 independent countries in the world. The line which you see there, the red line, is the proportion of countries that existed in each year that had democratic regimes. And as you see, this proportion was very low. It increased basically after 1900 and then during the war period, interwar period, fell briefly in the interwar period. And then that little dip you see comes from the fact that many new countries became independent and many of them became non-democracies, autocracies at that time. But in the recent era, as you see, after about 1990, the proportion of countries that have democratic regimes has really skyrocketed, and it's now more than 60%. Now, what you see here behind me is basically a distribution of the length of time that democracies existed in particular countries. And you have to realize that in some countries, many countries had a democratic period and then a dictatorial period, democratic period and a dictatorial period. Argentina, for example, had 8 democratic periods. Yes? So what you see here is that most democracies have not lasted for a very long time. Korea, the longest in the United States so far. Korea, at 34 years now, since 1988, is already a long-lasting democracy. And finally, the last picture I want to show you is the upper part, the one in green, the upper line, is the proportion of elections that occurred in each year which the incumbent party, the party in power, had lost. And the lower line is the proportion of elections in each year which the incumbent party had lost and accepted a defeat. Because yes, we have this little divergence. Mr. Trump in the United States, perhaps Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil, we still don't know, who lose elections but refuse to accept the result. Again, I want to show to you that the change in power through elections, peaceful change in power through elections, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Now, the question becomes then, so how does the system work? And The point of departure in any understanding of politics is that in every society and every time there are conflicts. That's unavoidable. Yes. Some conflicts are economic, some are cultural, of education, family policy, and whatnot. Some are purely symbolic. Some are major, some are very frivolous, minor. There was a government in Weimar Germany that fell because it wanted to change the colors of the national flag. So even kind of minor, which seems symbolic issues, can evoke real passion. Now, once we have conflict, the question becomes, so how do we, I don't want to say resolve it, because we never resolve them once and for all, but how do we process conflicts in relative liberty and peace? That's really my question, yes? And they can be processed by some rules, mainly elections, I'll say why in a second, or they can generate violent opposition and sometimes military intervention. Okay? We have several mechanisms in our societies for processing conflicts. The judicial system is one of them. Collective bargaining systems are another one of them. But elections are unique. Elections are unique because that's the only mechanism open to all in which everybody has an equal right to participate. So the most important aspect then is processing conflicts by election. How does it work? If you permit a very schematic characterization. There are elections. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Winning means that the winning party can realize more of its interests, norms, or values than the losers. But what matters in here is how much do the losers lose? What are the stakes in an election? They cannot be too low, because then elections just don't matter. But they cannot be too high. The loser cannot lose too much. And the other aspect is whether the losers can have a reasonable expectation to become winners in the future. Yes? That even though you lost this election, maybe you will lose the next one. If the stakes are not too high, and if the losers do not lose forever, then elections work in peace. That does mean that the winners cannot try to make the life of the losers miserable, and that the winners cannot deny the losers the chance to win the next election. When these conditions are satisfied, conflicts are processed in relative liberty and peace, and I think that is the miracle of democracy. There are some statistical regularities very quickly. One is that it turns out, I discovered in 1997, that no democracy ever fell in a country that was wealthier, it had higher per capita income than Argentina in 1976. Since then, Thailand had a coup at a slightly higher income, but basically, in wealthy societies, democracy seems to be impregnable, seems to be stable. And in a society like Korea, it seems very secure. The second mechanism is that we learn from the past. It turns out that if a country had experienced several alternations in office through elections, then again, democracy is impregnable, is stable in those countries, and you Koreans already had sufficient number of alternations to think that democracy should last in this country. Having said that, democracy, I think, is vulnerable to two dangers. Traditionally, we would think, still about 30 years ago, we would think that the greatest danger comes from the military. That danger seems to have pretty much disappeared. Dangers we face now are more subtle and more gradual. Yes. One of us, I'm going to call it populism, but that word is used so often that don't attach much importance to it. This is the situation in which a government comes into office. That government very often appeals to some group of people on kind of ideological, religious, racist, nationalistic basis. It gains majority support. It violates democratic norms, increases the discretion in policy making by ignoring other or destroying other institutions. And it takes every measure to prevent the opposition from ever winning. And all of that with the knowledge and support among its political loyalists. If you think of, well, Hungary, Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey, India are examples. That's a slightly different danger than the danger of polarization. They're related, but they're not the same. I think polarization are situations in which people divide unconditionally into supporters and opponents of the government. And basically, by unconditionally, I mean whatever the government does, or whatever the opposition does, people are just built in stone. They support one side or support another side. And the disquieting aspect of the last few years, which I think we don't quite understand, is that the hostility between political forces has increased, and two, that sort of political divisions have built very deep roots in the society, that they permeate even workplaces, they permeate families. Yes. There are several countries which are deeply divided along political lines. Now, let me say, I just published a book on crisis of democracy, but I don't think that democracy in general is in crisis. In some countries, democracy works quite well. I think it works well in Spain and Germany and Argentina and Chile and Ghana and Kenya even recently. And it works well, I think, in Korea with all the crises and all the upheavals. But there are more countries where these two dangers have appeared and increased, both the populist danger and the polarization danger. Now, given these dangers, what can we do? How do we rethink democracy? I know that there are several talks following me in which the speakers will discuss various proposals and perhaps propose some solutions. So I'm just going to do it very schematically. I think some of our considerations have to be institutional. Yes, because we can manipulate our institutions to increase political representation, but perhaps at the cost of decisive majority government, so we face a trade-off. I think it's very important to think about the institutional place for the opposition, because we have to maintain incentives for the opposition, for the losers of the last election, not to obstruct, to cooperate. For example, both in France and in England, the chairmanship of the committee of the parliament which oversees government expenses has to be in the hands of the largest opposition party. Yes, so the opposition has kind of a guaranteed role in the governing process and an incentive to cooperate. But I think that the greatest concern is something which is not so easy to manage, and that is the political divisions. Yes? Democracy, unfortunately, is a system in which somebody loses, in which parties lose elections, which means that we are going to be on the losing side from time to time. And what we have to know is, what we have to understand, that the winners are like us. We have to learn to respect them. We have to learn to understand them. I'm going to finish by arguing against being complacent. I think we should not be complacent about the dangers for democracy, and we have to constantly think how to improve it. Democracy is a never-ending project. Thank you for listening.
네, 교수님 이렇게 만나 뵙게 돼서 대단히 영광입니다.
Thank you.
네, 먼저 오랫동안 교수님과 만남을 기다려온 SDF 관객분들한테 인사 부탁드리겠습니다.
Could I say? I'm sorry.
관객분들한테 인사 한번 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, yeah, I already did, yes.
네, 반갑습니다. 그럼 곧바로 SDF 현장 관객분들이 보내주신 질문을 전해드리겠습니다. 관객 김현님께서 질문해 주셨는데요. 포퓰리즘이 민주주의 사회에 부정적인 영향만 주는 현상인지 혹은 대중들에게 관심을 두는 민주주의 과정의 일부로 볼 수 있는 건지 궁금하다고 하셨습니다.
That's an excellent question. We often reject the populist critique of representative institutions. But at the same time, we bemoan economic and political inequalities that exist in our societies. And there's something inconsistent about that. Because if political institutions work the way we expected them to work 200 years ago, if political institutions, representative institutions work the way they should, we wouldn't have so much inequality. I'll give you a fact. In my city, where I live, in New York, there are 100,000 school children who are homeless, have no permanent residence. If our institutions work well, there would have been no homeless children in school. So there is something to the populist critique. What I'm more skeptical about are kind of common populist solutions. That I'm much more skeptical about, and in part because many of them are directed against political parties, and we have to work through political parties.
네, 다음 질문은 저희 포럼 연사분 가운데 한 분이 질문을 주신 건지 아니면 이름이 같은 분인지는 잘 모르겠습니다만 브라이언의 질문입니다. 이 분열의 시대에 정부와 언론계 인사의 책임은 무엇일지, 또 우리는 어떻게 열린 토론을 할 수 있을지 교수님 답변 부탁드립니다.
I think that the only honest answer I can give is that I don't know. I'm a scholar, and unless I have seen or read good arguments and good evidence, I hesitate to pronounce myself on the topic. The problem of the media is so complex, and I have not studied it. I'll say, I don't know.
네. 네, 이번엔 스칼렛 수님이 보내주신 질문 드리겠습니다. 다수결이 민주주의지만 소수의 의견을 조금이라도 더 수용할 수 있는 방법은 뭐가 있을까요? 라고 질문해 주셨네요.
Yes, I think that reflecting minority opinions is very important. There is evidence. It turns out that people really value hearing in public their own opinions. Even if these opinions don't win elections, just the fact that you hear on television somebody who says what you would want to say, it turns out that it's really valuable. There's research, survey research, which shows that. which means that parties, electoral systems which promote many parties are more representative. I know that in the last election, I think Korea, there were 14 candidates in one round. I think that's very healthy, precisely because people can hear it. In France, at one time, there was a party of hunters and fishermen, which got 2% of the vote. But the hunters and fishermen knew that their demands are on the political agenda. So I think that really matters. And then there are other mechanisms of political representation, which I know several speakers will discuss during the rest of the day. And there are many new interesting proposals along these lines.
네. 계속해서 다음 질문 하나 더 드리겠습니다. 민주주의가 평등이나 인권과 같은 본질적인 가치를 지니고 있다는 관점에 대해서 교수님은 어떻게 생각하십니까?
Oh, I think that political equality is crucial, but I think we have a great deficit of political equality. Yes. We have formal rights. Formally, everybody is equal, but in fact, political influence is very unequal depending on economic resources, depending on educational resources. So effective political rights are not equal. And I think part of the function of democratic government is to do everything possible to make political rights effective for people who don't have the material and the educational conditions to exercise them. So yes, political rights are important.
네, 현장에서 많은 질문들이 들어오고 있는데 포퓰리즘과 정치적 양극화가 민주주의 실패의 원인이라고 보는지 아니면 결과라고 볼 수 있는지 이런 질문을 또 해오셨습니다.
Well, they are a result, but we don't quite know a result of what. When you start studying this literature, you will find that some people think that the causes of both are economic. Economists think that causes of everything are economic, yes? Other people think that they are cultural. And as social scientists, we really don't have a way, we don't have instruments to be able to tell which they are, which are more important than others. If you do typical study that we do, statistical study, what you will discover is that everything matters, both economic factors of different kinds, of cultural factors of different kinds, but nothing matters very much, which is not a very satisfactory answer. It's not a simple answer. So I think in the end we don't know. We don't know one other thing, whether the salience, the importance of cultural divisions, whether these divisions were always there in the past, but politicians did not dare raise them, talk about them, or whether they're actually a product of recent demographic transformations, immigration and whatnot. Even that is very hard for us to tell.
네. 다음은 김현주님의 질문입니다. 아마 이게 마지막 질문이 될 것 같은데요. 아까 이제 교수님 말씀하신 내용 가운데 야당의 정치 참여를 보장해야 한다 이런 내용이 있었는데 그걸 제도적으로 어떻게 보장할 수 있는지 그 방법이 궁금하다고 합니다.
No, well, they participate in the political system because they participate in elections. But in democracy, parties lose elections. Some parties lose. And they don't lose. What's essential about democracy, what's crucial is they don't lose forever. They lose for the next term, for the next 4 years, or maybe in the worst case, for the next 8 years. But I think it's really fundamental for us to understand that democracy generates temporary winners and temporary losers. And we have to learn how to lose.
자,
네.
교수님, 네, 끝으로 이제 앞서 민주주의는 완결되는 게 아니다라고 하셨는데 저희 오늘 주제기도 한 다시 쓰는 민주주의에 대해서 하나 여쭤보겠습니다. 다시 써야 할 민주주의에 대해서 강조하고 싶은 게 있다면 끝으로 한 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Well, all I want to emphasize is that really the work on democracy has to be perpetual. On the one hand, it's important to understand what the dangers are, because without understanding them, we don't have a guide to action. But even more, even without dangers, it really is a never-finished project. We can always think of improving it. We can think how to improve representation, how to equalize political rights. There are always new democratic projects, and I think it's the role of the political forces to constantly put on the agenda proposals for improving democracy.
네, 여러 쉽지 않은 질문들이 많았는데 좋은 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 지금까지 아담 쉐보르스키 교수님이었고요. 교수님 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.